Sarah Mitchell was just another face in the crowd at JFK International Airport that Tuesday morning. She stood in line at Gate 14, clutching her boarding pass for Flight 447 to Los Angeles, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder and a lukewarm coffee in her free hand. To everyone around her, she looked like any other business traveler. Tired eyes, wrinkled blazer, the kind of person who flew twice a month for corporate meetings and thought nothing of it. At 34, Sarah worked as a data analyst for a tech company, spending her days buried in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Her life was predictable, safe, ordinary. She preferred it that way. The chaos of her past was something she'd deliberately left behind, locked away in a part of her mind she rarely visited anymore. As she settled into seat 12F, middle aisle, Sarah pulled out her phone to check emails one last time before takeoff. Around her, passengers stowed their carry-ons, adjusted their seatbelts, and settled in for what should have been a routine 6-hour flight across the country. The elderly man beside her smiled politely. A young mother across the aisle struggled to calm her crying infant. Everything was normal, mundane, forgettable. But Sarah carried secrets that no one on that Boeing 777 could have imagined. Hidden beneath her corporate exterior was a past that had shaped her in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. She had once lived in a world where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, where calm under pressure wasn't just preferred, it was essential for survival. As Flight 447's engines roared to life and the massive aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to push away the familiar sensation that always came with takeoff. The feeling that she was meant to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else entirely. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours, that someone else would emerge from the shadows of her carefully constructed ordinary life, and everything would change forever. The plane lifted into the clear morning sky, carrying 312 souls toward what should have been an uneventful journey. But fate had other plans. 2.5 hours into the flight, Sarah was deep in a quarterly budget analysis when the first sign of trouble appeared. It started as a subtle vibration through the cabin floor, so slight that most passengers didn't notice. But Sarah felt it immediately. Her fingers paused over her keyboard as every nerve in her body suddenly came alive. She looked up from her laptop, scanning the cabin with eyes that had been trained to notice what others missed. The flight attendants continued their service, smiling and pouring drinks, but Sarah caught something in their movements, a slight tension, a quicker pace, the way one of them glanced toward the cockpit door with barely concealed concern. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties and will need to make an unscheduled landing in Denver. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. The word minor didn't match the captain's tone. Sarah had heard that voice before, the carefully controlled cadence of someone trying not to panic a crowd while facing something serious, very serious. Within minutes, the minor technical difficulties revealed themselves. The plane began to shake violently. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling as the cabin pressure suddenly plummeted. Passengers screamed as their ears popped, and the aircraft lurched to one side, then the other, like a massive bird struggling to stay airborne. Sarah's laptop slammed shut and slid to the floor, but she barely noticed. Her training kicked in automatically. Assess, analyze, act. She counted the seconds between each violent shake, measured the angle of descent, listened to the changing pitch of the engines. One was clearly failing, possibly both. Around her, chaos erupted. The elderly man beside her clutched his chest, gasping for air. The young mother across the aisle held her baby tight, tears streaming down her face. Passengers sobbed, prayed, and called loved ones on their phones, convinced they were about to die. But Sarah didn't panic. She couldn't. Her mind had shifted into a mode she hadn't accessed in 8 years, a mental state that had once been as natural as breathing. She was no longer a data analyst from Seattle. She was someone else entirely, someone who had been forged in the crucible of crisis and trained to function when everything fell apart. A flight attendant stumbled past, trying to maintain order while clearly terrified herself. Sarah reached out and steadied her. "What's the real situation?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that made the attendant stop and really look at her. "Both engines are failing," the woman whispered, her professional composure cracking. "We're losing altitude fast. The captain, he's trying everything, but—" Sarah stood up, her movement so calm and deliberate that it seemed to create a pocket of stillness in the surrounding pandemonium. "I need to speak with the captain," she said. The flight attendant shook her head. "Ma'am, I can't. I'm former military," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a weight that brooked no argument. "Special operations. If your captain needs help, I can provide it." For a moment, the flight attendant just stared at her, seeing something in Sarah's eyes that hadn't been there before. Not panic, not fear, but purpose. Cold, focused, unshakable purpose. The plane lurched again, more violently this time, and several passengers screamed. Emergency lights flickered on and off. The smell of burning electronics began to fill the cabin. "I'll check with the cockpit," the attendant said, then hurried toward the front of the plane. Sarah remained standing, one hand gripping the seat back for balance, her eyes scanning the cabin with tactical precision. She was already calculating passenger count, exit locations, potential injuries, time to impact if they couldn't pull out of this descent. 8 years ago, she had walked away from a life where these calculations were routine. She had traded her military uniform for business suits, her tactical gear for laptops, her team for spreadsheets. She thought she had left that world behind forever. But as Flight 447 plummeted toward the Earth with 312 terrified souls aboard, Sarah Mitchell realized that some things never truly leave you. They just wait, dormant, until the moment when everything depends on who you really are beneath the mask you've chosen to wear. The flight attendant was returning, moving quickly through the chaos, her face pale but determined, and Sarah knew her ordinary life was about to end. The flight attendant returned, her face grim but resolute. "The captain wants to see you. Now." As Sarah made her way toward the cockpit, her mind drifted back 8 years to a life she had deliberately buried. She had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell then, part of an elite Air Force Pararescue unit, the Guardian Angels, who dropped into impossible situations to save lives when no one else could reach them. She had been one of only 12 women ever selected for PJ training, enduring 2 years of the most brutal military preparation imaginable: underwater demolition, high-altitude parachute jumps, emergency medical training, and most importantly, crisis aviation. She had learned to fly anything with wings, to land in conditions that would terrify seasoned pilots, to make split-second decisions when mechanical failure meant death for everyone aboard. But that life had ended abruptly during a rescue mission in Afghanistan. Her team had been extracting wounded soldiers from a crashed helicopter when an IED explosion killed 3 of her closest friends and left her with shrapnel in her shoulder and survivor's guilt that ate at her soul. The military offered her medals, promotions, a hero's welcome home. Instead, she had quietly resigned, changed her name from Sarah Chen Mitchell to just Sarah Mitchell, and disappeared into civilian life. She told herself she wanted normalcy, safety, predictability. The truth was simpler and more painful. She couldn't bear to lose anyone else on her watch. For 8 years, she had successfully convinced herself that person no longer existed. She was just Sarah, the data analyst, Sarah who lived alone in a quiet Seattle apartment, Sarah who avoided risk and commitment, and anything that might require her to be responsible for other people's lives. But as she approached the cockpit door of Flight 447, muscle memory began to override conscious thought. Her breathing slowed and deepened, her vision sharpened, her hands stopped trembling. The chaos around her faded into background noise as her mind shifted into the cold analytical state that had once made her legendary among her peers. The flight attendant knocked on the cockpit door. "Captain Rodriguez, I have the passenger you requested." The door opened, revealing a scene of controlled panic. Warning lights flashed across every surface. Both pilots were drenched in sweat, their hands flying over controls that seemed to be failing faster than they could compensate. Captain Rodriguez looked up as Sarah entered, and in that moment, he saw something that gave him the first hope he'd felt since the crisis began. He wasn't looking at a passenger anymore. He was looking at a soldier. The cockpit was a symphony of alarms and flashing red lights. Captain Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with graying temples, looked up as Sarah entered. His co-pilot, younger and clearly overwhelmed, was frantically working through emergency checklists while sweat dripped onto the instrument panel. "You said you're military?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "Air Force Pararescue," Sarah replied, slipping into the jump seat behind them. "Certified on multiple aircraft types, including commercial jets. What's our situation?" "Both engines are failing. Different systems. which means it's not fuel contamination. We've lost primary hydraulics. Backup hydraulics are at 30%, and we're losing altitude at 3,000 feet per minute. Denver's 40 minutes away, but we'll be on the ground in 12 minutes whether we want to be or not. Sarah's eyes swept the instrument panel, her mind automatically processing the cascade of failures. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was sabotage. Someone had systematically compromised multiple redundant systems, timing it perfectly for when the plane would be over the most desolate part of Colorado. "Sir," the co-pilot's voice cracked, "I'm reading total hydraulic failure now. We can't control the flaps, landing gear, or steering." Captain Rodriguez's face went white. "That's impossible." "The backup systems are designed to fail if someone knows exactly which circuits to target," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen this before. "This is a coordinated attack. Someone with intimate knowledge of this aircraft's systems wanted this plane to go down over the mountains, where there would be no survivors and no investigation." Both pilots stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" Rodriguez demanded. "Because 8 years ago I helped design the countermeasures for exactly this type of attack," Sarah said grimly. "The military was concerned about terrorist infiltration of airline maintenance crews. We ran scenarios, tested vulnerabilities, developed protocols. This is textbook sabotage, and I know how to beat it." She moved to the co-pilot station, her hands already reaching for controls she hadn't touched in nearly a decade. "I need you to trust me completely. We're going to do something that's not in any manual." "What are you talking about?" the co-pilot asked, but he was already moving aside, recognizing the confidence in her movements. Sarah's fingers flew over the emergency systems panel. "We're going to manually isolate the compromised circuits and reroute control through the auxiliary power unit. It'll give us maybe 10 minutes of limited control, enough to attempt a landing if we can find the right spot." "The auxiliary power unit isn't designed to handle primary flight controls," Rodriguez protested. "No, it's not. But it's also not connected to the main systems, which means whoever sabotaged this plane couldn't touch it." Sarah was already pulling access panels, exposing bundles of wires and circuit boards. "I need something metal. A knife, scissors, anything sharp." The co-pilot handed her a multi-tool from his flight bag. Sarah began carefully cutting specific wires, her movements precise and confident, despite the violent shaking of the aircraft. "You're going to electrocute yourself," Rodriguez warned. "Only if I cut the wrong wire," Sarah replied, sweat beading on her forehead as she worked. "And I won't." Outside the cockpit windows, the Rocky Mountains loomed closer with each passing second. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no safe landing options. They were flying over some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Sarah finished her rewiring and moved back to the controls. "Captain, I need you to pull the main hydraulic breakers, all of them. We're going to force the system to accept auxiliary power as primary." "That could shut down everything," he protested. "Everything's already shut down," Sarah shot back. "This is our only chance." Rodriguez hesitated for a split second, then began pulling breakers. The cockpit went dark except for emergency lighting. For a terrifying moment, they were flying blind. Then Sarah's jury-rigged system came online. Limited control returned to the rudder and elevators. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull them out of their death spiral. "I've got partial control," she announced, her hands steady on the yoke. "But we need a landing site, somewhere flat, long, and preferably not covered in trees." The co-pilot was frantically scanning his charts. "There's an abandoned military airfield about 15 miles northeast, Buckley Reserve Strip. It was decommissioned in the 90s, but the runway might still be intact." "Might be?" Rodriguez asked. "It's our only option," Sarah said, already banking the aircraft toward the coordinates. "Captain, I need you to get on the radio, emergency frequency. Tell them we're coming in hard and fast, and we'll need every fire truck and ambulance in 3 counties. As they flew toward their uncertain salvation, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had once defined her military service. This was what she had been born to do, not analyze spreadsheets or attend corporate meetings, but stand between innocent people and disaster, using her skills and training to snatch life from the jaws of death. The abandoned airfield appeared on the horizon, a thin strip of cracked concrete cutting through the wilderness. It was shorter than any commercial runway, surrounded by pine trees, and covered with patches of snow and ice. "That's not a runway," the co-pilot whispered. "That's a death trap." "It's home," Sarah replied, beginning their final approach. "Captain, I need you to prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Tell the passengers to assume crash positions and prepare for impact. Don't sugarcoat it. They need to know this is going to be rough." As Rodriguez made the announcement, Sarah focused entirely on the impossible task ahead. She had perhaps one chance to get this right. Too steep, and they'd slam into the ground. Too shallow, and they'd overshoot into the trees. The margin for error was essentially zero. The auxiliary power system was already showing signs of strain. Warning lights flickered as the jury-rigged connections struggled to handle the load. She had minutes, maybe less, before her improvised solution failed completely. 500 feet, the co-pilot called out, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Sarah could see individual trees now, their snow-laden branches reaching up like fingers trying to snag the aircraft. The runway looked impossibly narrow from this angle, more like a sidewalk than a place to land a commercial jet. 200 feet, 100, 50. The wheels touched down hard, bounced once, then slammed back onto the concrete with a sound like thunder. Sarah immediately deployed every drag system she could access. Thrust reversers, spoilers, even the emergency brake chutes that weren't supposed to exist on this aircraft model, but had been secretly installed as part of the anti-terrorism upgrades. The plane screamed down the short runway, shedding speed but not nearly fast enough. The trees at the far end grew larger and larger in the windscreen. "We're not going to stop in time," Rodriguez said, his voice eerily calm. Sarah made one final desperate decision. She deliberately ground-looped the aircraft, using the landing gear as a pivot point to swing the plane sideways. It was a maneuver that would almost certainly destroy the aircraft, but it was their only chance of avoiding the trees. The Boeing 777 spun like a massive top, its momentum carrying it sideways off the runway and into the snow-covered field beyond. Metal screamed against earth as the landing gear collapsed and the fuselage scraped along the ground, throwing up a shower of sparks and debris. Finally, impossibly, they stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the settling of twisted metal and the hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. Then, from the cabin behind them, came the sound Sarah had been praying to hear. Voices, crying, shouting, but alive voices. They had done it. All 312 souls aboard Flight 447 had survived the impossible. If you're feeling the same chills I am right now, smash that like button and tell me in the comments, what would you do if you discovered you had the power to save hundreds of lives? Would you step up like Sarah did, even if it meant facing your deepest fears? Don't forget to subscribe because we're just getting started with Sarah's incredible journey. And trust me, what happens next will completely change how you think about second chances and hidden potential. In the immediate aftermath of the crash landing, an eerie silence settled over the twisted wreckage of Flight 447. Steam rose from the buckled engines, and the acrid smell of burnt metal filled the air. The aircraft lay broken but intact in the snow-covered field, its fuselage cracked but not breached, its passengers shaken but breathing. Sarah sat motionless in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. She had just performed a landing that aviation experts would later call impossible, bringing down a sabotaged commercial airliner with jury-rigged controls onto an abandoned runway in the middle of the Colorado wilderness. Captain Rodriguez turned to look at her, his face pale but filled with something approaching awe. "In 30 years of flying," he said quietly, "I've never seen anything like that. You didn't just save this plane. You saved everyone on it." The co-pilot was already on the radio, coordinating with emergency services that were racing toward their location. Through the cracked windscreen, Sarah could see the first helicopters appearing on the horizon, their rotors cutting through the thin mountain air. But it was the sound from the cabin that mattered most. The voices of passengers calling out to each other, flight attendants coordinating evacuation procedures, children crying not from injury, but from fear that was already beginning to fade. They were alive, all of them. Sarah finally released her grip on the controls and slumped back in her seat. For 8 years, she had convinced herself that her military training was a burden, a reminder of friends lost and missions that had cost too much. She had buried that part of herself so deeply that she almost believed it no longer existed. But in the space of 30 minutes, everything had changed. The skills she thought she had abandoned forever had emerged when they were needed most. The instincts she had tried to suppress had saved 312 lives. The person she had been trying not to be had turned out to be exactly who she needed to be. As emergency crews surrounded the aircraft and began the careful process of evacuating passengers, Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had faced the ultimate test of her abilities and her character, and she had not been found wanting. The data analyst from Seattle was gone, perhaps forever. In her place sat someone who had remembered what it meant to stand between innocent people and disaster, to use every skill and every ounce of courage in service of others. She was Sarah Mitchell, former Air Force Pararescue specialist, and for the first time in 8 years she was exactly where she belonged. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, but Sarah barely heard them. She was already thinking about what came next, about the life she would build from this moment forward, about the person she had rediscovered in the crucible of crisis. She was ready to be that person again. The evacuation of Flight 447 unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Despite the dramatic crash landing, injuries were surprisingly minor, some bruises, a few broken bones, several cases of shock, but no fatalities. As passengers slid down emergency chutes onto the snow-covered ground, many turned back to look at the broken aircraft that had somehow delivered them safely to Earth. Sarah was among the last to leave the cockpit. As she emerged into the cabin, a spontaneous round of applause erupted from the passengers who had witnessed her walk to the front of the plane hours earlier. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew enough to recognize that the quiet woman in the wrinkled blazer had somehow saved their lives. "Thank you," whispered the elderly man who had been sitting beside her, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know what you did, but thank you." The young mother with the baby pressed a piece of paper into Sarah's hand, her contact information. "I want my daughter to know your name," she said. "I want her to know that when everything seemed lost, someone stepped up." Outside, the scene was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles from 3 counties had converged on the remote airfield, their red and blue lights painting the snow in brilliant colors. Paramedics triaged passengers, while investigators began the preliminary work of understanding how a commercial airliner had ended up in pieces in a Colorado wilderness. Sarah found herself immediately surrounded by officials. FBI agents wanted to know about her sabotage theory. FAA investigators needed to understand her emergency modifications to the aircraft systems. Military liaisons were quietly verifying her credentials and clearance levels, but it was the media attention that caught her off guard. News helicopters circled overhead, and within hours reporters were hiking through the snow to reach the crash site. Someone had leaked her name and military background, and suddenly Sarah Mitchell was no longer an anonymous data analyst from Seattle. "Ms. Mitchell!" shouted a reporter, thrusting a microphone toward her face. "How does it feel to be a hero?" Sarah recoiled from the attention, but Captain Rodriguez stepped beside her, his presence lending authority to her words. "I'm not a hero," she said quietly. "I'm someone who did what needed to be done. The real heroes are the first responders who got here so quickly, the flight attendants who kept everyone calm, the passengers who trusted us to bring them home safely." "But you saved 312 lives," the reporter pressed. "You landed a plane that was supposed to be unflyable." Sarah looked back at the wreckage of Flight 447, its broken wings glinting in the afternoon sun. "I used training that the United States Air Force gave me years ago. I did my job, that's all." But even as she deflected the praise, Sarah could feel something fundamental shifting inside her. For 8 years, she had defined herself by what she had lost, by the friends who hadn't come home, by the guilt that had driven her from military service. Now, surrounded by 312 people who were alive because of her actions, she began to understand that her story wasn't about loss, it was about purpose. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of the sabotage plot. A maintenance worker with ties to a domestic terrorist organization had systematically compromised multiple aircraft systems, timing the failures to occur over the most remote part of the flight path. It was an attack designed to leave no survivors and no clear evidence of foul play. Sarah's quick recognition of the sabotage pattern and her improvised solution had not only saved lives but had also preserved crucial evidence that led to the arrest of 3 additional conspirators and the prevention of similar attacks on other flights. The FBI offered her a position as a consultant on aviation security. The Air Force wanted her to return to active duty with a promotion and her choice of assignments. Airlines competed to hire her as a safety director, but Sarah found herself drawn to a different path entirely. 3 weeks after the crash, She stood in the office of Dr. Patricia Vance, director of the Colorado Search and Rescue Training Institute. The walls were covered with photos of successful rescues, certificates of appreciation from grateful families, and maps marking the locations where lives had been saved in the unforgiving wilderness. "We need someone with your background," Dr. Vance explained. "Someone who understands both the technical and human elements of crisis response. Someone who can train the next generation of rescue specialists." Sarah looked out the window at the mountains where Flight 447 had come down. Somewhere out there, maintenance crews were still clearing debris from the crash site. But more importantly, 312 people were going home to their families, returning to their lives, getting second chances they might never have had. "I'm interested," Sarah said. "But I have conditions. I want to develop a program specifically for aviation emergencies. I want to train people not just to respond to crashes, but to prevent them. And I want to work with at-risk youth, kids who need to understand that their past doesn't define their future." Dr. Vance smiled. "I think we can arrange that." As Sarah shook hands on her new position, she felt the final pieces of her old life falling away. The data analyst who had boarded Flight 447 that morning was gone forever, replaced by someone who had remembered what it meant to serve something larger than herself. She was ready to begin again. 6 months after the crash of Flight 447, Sarah Mitchell stood before a classroom of 24 students at the newly established Mitchell Center for Crisis Aviation Training. The facility, built with funding from grateful airlines and government grants, occupied a sprawling complex in the foothills outside Denver, complete with flight simulators, emergency response training areas, and dormitories for residential programs. Her students were a diverse group, former military personnel transitioning to civilian aviation careers, airline pilots seeking advanced emergency training, and most importantly to Sarah, a dozen teenagers from troubled backgrounds who had been given scholarships to participate in the program. "Crisis doesn't announce itself," Sarah told them, standing beside a full-scale cockpit simulator. "It doesn't wait for you to be ready, trained, or confident. It arrives when you least expect it and demands everything you have to give. The question isn't whether you'll face a crisis. The question is whether you'll be prepared to meet it." Among her students was Marcus Rodriguez Jr., the 17-year-old son of Captain Rodriguez. The boy had been struggling with drug addiction and petty crime before his father's near-death experience had shocked him into seeking a different path. Now he was one of Sarah's most dedicated students, channeling his rebellious energy into mastering the complex skills of emergency aviation. "Ms. Mitchell," Marcus asked during a break between simulator sessions, "do you ever regret leaving your old life? I mean, you had a safe job, no stress, no responsibility for other people's lives." Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she had asked herself many times during the difficult months of transition. "I thought I wanted safety," she replied. "I convinced myself that avoiding risk was the same as finding peace, but I learned something important on Flight 447. You can't run from who you really are forever. Eventually, life has a way of demanding that you step up and be the person you were meant to be." The Mitchell Center had quickly gained a reputation as the premier training facility for aviation emergency response. Students came from around the world to learn Sarah's methods, which combined technical expertise with psychological preparation for high-stress situations. But the program that meant the most to Sarah was her work with at-risk youth. These were kids who had been written off by society, former gang members, drug addicts, high school dropouts, young people who had never been given a real chance to succeed. Sarah saw something in them that others missed, the same hunger for purpose that had once driven her to military service. "Every one of you has the potential to save lives," she told them during their graduation ceremony 9 months after the program began. "Not because you're perfect, but because you've learned to function under pressure. You've discovered that your past doesn't define your future. You've proven that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're properly trained and motivated." The success stories were remarkable. Maria Santos, a former gang member from East LA, became the first Latina pilot hired by a major airline in 5 years. James Washington, who had been homeless at 16, was now studying aerospace engineering at MIT on a full scholarship. 12 of the first 20 at-risk students had gone on to careers in aviation, emergency services, or military service, but it was the ripple effects that truly demonstrated the program's impact. Each graduate became a mentor to others, carrying Sarah's message of redemption and purpose into their communities. They spoke at schools, worked with youth organizations, and served as living proof that transformation was possible. The media attention never fully subsided. Sarah appeared on magazine covers, gave TED Talks, and was invited to speak at conferences around the world. But she carefully managed her public profile, always redirecting attention to the work of the center and the achievements of her students. 1 year after the crash, Sarah received a letter that would change her perspective on her own story. It came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a trauma surgeon at Denver General Hospital, who had been on duty the day Flight 447's passengers were brought in for treatment. "Dear Ms. Mitchell," the letter began, "I wanted you to know about something that happened in my emergency room that day. Among the passengers we treated was a 10-year-old girl named Emma Chen. She had minor injuries from the crash, but she was deeply traumatized by the experience. For weeks afterward, she had nightmares, refused to leave her house, and stopped speaking to anyone outside her immediate family. But then, something remarkable happened. Emma learned about your story, how you had overcome your own trauma to save everyone on that plane. She became obsessed with understanding how you had found the courage to act when everything seemed hopeless. Her parents brought her to meet you, and after that conversation, everything changed. Emma began speaking again. She started attending school regularly. Most importantly, she began talking about becoming a pilot herself someday. Last week, she gave a presentation to her 5th grade class about courage and resilience, using your story as an example of how people can overcome their fears to help others. I'm writing to tell you this because I think you need to understand something. You didn't just save 312 lives on Flight 447. You saved Emma's future. You showed her that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something greater. The letter was signed with a simple note. Emma asked me to tell you that she's going to be a pilot like you someday. I believe her. Sarah read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her desk. Through her office window, she could see her current class of students working through emergency scenarios in the simulator complex. Some were struggling, some were excelling, but all of them were pushing themselves to become more than they had been before. That evening, Sarah drove to the memorial that had been erected at the site where Flight 447 had crashed. It was a simple granite monument inscribed with the names of all 312 passengers and crew members, along with the words, "In gratitude for second chances and the courage to seize them." She often came here when she needed to remember why her work mattered. Tonight, she brought Emma's letter with her, reading it again by the light of the memorial's eternal flame. As she stood in the gathering darkness, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years ago, she had walked away from military service convinced that she was broken, that the loss of her friends had rendered her unfit for the responsibility of protecting others. She had spent nearly a decade hiding from her true calling, burying her talents beneath the safe mediocrity of corporate life. But crisis has a way of revealing truth, and in the cockpit of Flight 447, Sarah had discovered that her scars didn't make her weak. They made her strong. Her experience with loss hadn't disqualified her from saving lives. It had prepared her for it. Now, 2 years after the crash, the Mitchell Center had trained over 500 emergency responders and aviation professionals. The at-risk youth program had expanded to include partnerships with schools in 12 states. Sarah's methods were being adopted by training facilities around the world. More importantly, the ripple effects continued to spread. Former students were starting their own programs, sharing Sarah's philosophy of redemption and purpose with new generations of young people who needed to hear that their circumstances didn't define their potential. As Sarah prepared to leave the memorial, her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Rodriguez Jr., who was now in his 2nd year of flight training. "Ms. Mitchell, just wanted you to know, I soloed today. Clean landing, no drama. Thanks for showing me that I could be more than my mistakes. See you next weekend for the new student orientation." Sarah smiled as she walked back to her car. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to prove that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they were given the right training and motivation. But tonight, she was content to know that somewhere out there, a 10-year-old girl named Emma Chen was dreaming of becoming a pilot, and that dream was possible because 312 people had lived to tell their stories of survival and second chances. The legacy of Flight 447 wasn't just about a dramatic rescue or a moment of heroism. It was about the ongoing work of transformation. The daily choice to use one's gifts in service of others, to turn personal pain into collective healing, to prove that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. Sarah drove home through the mountain darkness, already planning the next day's lessons, already thinking about the next group of students who would walk through her doors carrying their own burdens and dreams. She had found her purpose at last, and it was more fulfilling than any life she could have imagined. 5 years had passed since Flight 447 carved its dramatic path through the Colorado wilderness, and the world had moved on to new crises, new heroes, new stories of survival and redemption. But in a quiet corner of the aviation industry, Sarah Mitchell's influence continued to grow in ways that defied measurement. The Mitchell Center had become more than a training facility. It had evolved into a movement. Graduates of the program now worked in every major airline, in emergency services across 3 continents, and in military units around the world. They carried with them not just technical skills, but a philosophy that had been forged in the crucible of crisis, that ordinary people, properly prepared and motivated, could accomplish the impossible. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood in the center's main hangar, watching as her latest class of at-risk youth worked through their final examinations. These 20 teenagers had arrived 6 months earlier, carrying the weight of broken homes, criminal records, addiction and despair. Now they moved with confidence and purpose, their hands steady on flight controls, their voices calm as they worked through emergency scenarios that would challenge seasoned professionals. Among them was Emma Chen, now 15 years old, and every bit as determined as her letter had predicted 5 years earlier. The little girl who had been traumatized by the crash had grown into a poised young woman with an intuitive understanding of aviation that impressed even Sarah's most experienced instructors. "Emergency descent complete," Emma announced from the simulator cockpit, her voice carrying the same calm authority that Sarah remembered from her own military training. "All passengers secure. Emergency services notified, landing approach initiated." Sarah smiled as she watched Emma guide her simulated aircraft through a perfect emergency landing. The girl had overcome not just her trauma from Flight 447, but also the skepticism of those who believed that someone so young couldn't master such complex skills. She had proven them wrong through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. "Excellent work," Sarah told the class as they completed their final exercise. "You've demonstrated something that many people never learn, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite it. Tomorrow, you'll receive your certifications and begin the next phase of your journeys. Some of you will pursue careers in aviation, others in emergency services, still others in fields we haven't even discussed. But all of you will carry forward the most important lesson, that your past does not define your potential." After the students had left for the day, Sarah walked through the center's halls, past walls lined with photographs and letters from graduates. There was Marcus Rodriguez Jr., now a commercial pilot for United Airlines, standing beside his aircraft with a crew of fellow pilots he had trained in emergency procedures. There was Maria Santos, who had become not just a pilot but an advocate for women in aviation, speaking at conferences around the world about breaking barriers and overcoming adversity. Each photograph told a story of transformation, of lives redirected from paths of destruction toward purposes of service and meaning. But perhaps the most powerful testimonials came in the form of simple letters from people whose lives had been touched by the program's graduates. One letter, framed and hanging in Sarah's office, came from the parents of a family that had been rescued from a mountain plane crash by a search and rescue team led by one of her former students. "We will never know your name, but our children are alive today because someone you trained was ready when we needed them most. Thank you for teaching people to be heroes." Another came from a high school principal in Detroit. "The young man you sent us has transformed our aviation program. More importantly, he's shown our students that their circumstances don't have to define their futures. Enrollment in our technical programs has tripled since he arrived." As evening approached, Sarah made her way to the center's memorial garden, a quiet space where plaques honored the memory of those who had died in aviation accidents and celebrated those who had survived them. At the center of the garden stood a simple stone bench with an inscription, "In memory of those we could not save, in honor of those we did, and in hope for those we will." She often came here to think, especially when facing difficult decisions about the center's future, Tonight, she was considering an offer that could change everything. The United Nations had approached her about developing a global crisis response training program, one that would extend far beyond aviation to include natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and humanitarian emergencies. It was an opportunity to impact millions of lives, to spread the principles she had developed to every corner of the world, but it would also mean leaving the hands-on work she loved, the daily interaction with students who reminded her why this work mattered. As she sat in the gathering darkness, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Emma Chen. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to be the first to tell you. I've been accepted to the Air Force Academy. I know it's 4 years away, but I wanted you to know that when I graduate, I want to come back and teach here. This place saved my life and I want to help save others." The message was followed by another, this one from Captain Rodriguez. "Sarah, I'm retiring next month after 35 years of flying. I wanted you to know that what happened on Flight 447 wasn't just about that one day. It was about proving that preparation and courage can overcome any crisis. Thank you for reminding me why I became a pilot in the first place." Then came a flood of similar messages, as if her former students and colleagues had somehow coordinated their timing. Messages of gratitude, updates on careers and families, stories of lives saved and disasters averted by people who had learned their skills in her classrooms and simulators. Sarah realized that she was witnessing something remarkable, not just the success of individual students, but the creation of a network of people committed to service, to excellence, to the belief that ordinary individuals could accomplish extraordinary things when properly prepared and motivated. The decision about the UN offer suddenly became clear. She would accept it, but on her terms. The Mitchell Center would remain her base of operations, continuing its work with at-risk youth and aviation professionals, but its influence would expand globally, with satellite programs in countries around the world, all built on the same foundation of technical excellence and personal transformation. As she walked back toward the center's main building, Sarah passed the hangar where Flight 447's reconstructed cockpit was displayed as a teaching tool. Students often asked her what it felt like to sit in that seat again, to relive the moments when 312 lives hung in the balance. The answer was always the same. It felt like coming home. Not because she enjoyed crisis or sought out danger, but because she had finally understood her purpose. She was meant to stand between innocent people and disaster, to use her skills and experience to prepare others for the moments when everything would depend on their ability to remain calm, think clearly, and act decisively. The data analyst who had boarded Flight 447 that morning 5 years ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who had embraced her true calling. Sarah Mitchell was no longer running from her past. She was building a future where the lessons learned from tragedy could prevent others from experiencing the same pain. As she turned off the lights in her office and prepared to head home, Sarah took one last look at the photograph on her desk, a group shot of Flight 447's passengers and crew taken at their first reunion. They were smiling, laughing, celebrating not just their survival, but their continued commitment to living lives worthy of the second chance they had been given. In the center of the photograph, barely visible among the crowd, was Sarah herself. She wasn't posing or seeking attention. She was simply there, part of the community she had helped create, one face among many in a story that belonged to all of them. That was exactly how she wanted to be remembered, not as a hero, but as someone who had done her job when it mattered most and who had spent the rest of her life helping others do the same. The legacy of Flight 447 would continue long after Sarah was gone, carried forward by students who would become teachers, by survivors who would become rescuers, by ordinary people who had learned that they were capable of extraordinary things. And somewhere in the darkness above, aircraft continued to cross the sky safely, their passengers unaware that their security depended in part on lessons learned from a day when everything went wrong, and one person refused to let that be the end of the story. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Flight 447 reminds us that heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about being prepared to step up when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances. Sarah's journey from a traumatized veteran hiding in corporate anonymity to a leader who transforms lives teaches us several profound truths. First, our past experiences, even our most painful ones, don't disqualify us from greatness. They prepare us for it. The very trauma that drove Sarah away from military service ultimately gave her the skills and perspective needed to save 312 lives and inspire thousands more. Second, true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Sarah was terrified as she took control of that failing aircraft, but she had trained herself to function effectively under pressure, to think clearly when others panic, to make difficult decisions when lives hang in the balance. Most importantly, Sarah's story shows us that redemption is always possible. No matter how far we've fallen, how much we've lost, or how badly we think we've failed, there's always an opportunity to begin again, to use our experiences in service of something greater than ourselves. The young people who graduate from the Mitchell Center carry this message into the world, that circumstances don't define potential, that proper preparation can overcome almost any obstacle, and that ordinary individuals can accomplish extraordinary things when they're motivated by purpose rather than personal gain. Sarah's legacy isn't measured in the dramatic moments of crisis, but in the quiet daily work of transformation, helping others discover their own capacity for courage, teaching them to turn their pain into purpose, showing them that their stories don't have to end with their worst moments. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, Sarah Mitchell's story offers hope. It reminds us that there are people among us, quiet, unassuming individuals, who carry within themselves the skills and courage needed to face whatever challenges lie ahead. They might be sitting next to you on your next flight, working in the cubicle beside yours, or walking past you on the street. The question isn't whether heroes exist, it's whether we're prepared to become one when the moment demands it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own untapped potential or the quiet heroes in your own life, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what resonated most with you. Have you ever had a moment when you had to step up beyond what you thought you were capable of? Share your story. It might inspire someone else who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. These stories matter because they remind us that heroism isn't reserved for a special few. It's a choice available to all of us when we're willing to prepare, to serve, and to act when others need us most. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own potential for greatness. Sometimes we all need to hear that our past doesn't define our future, and that our greatest contributions might come from the very experiences we think have broken us. Until next time, remember, you never know when life will call upon you to be more than you ever thought possible. The question is, will you be ready?